Kirkpatrick Dobie was born in Dumfries 75 years ago. His family have lived in this town for hundreds of years. He was educated in Dumfries and did some writing in his youth. However, he only began writing seriously after a lifetime of work in the family business, a grain merchant. It's possible to see certain distinct themes in Dobie's work. He has some poems dealing with dogs, others with Dumfries and its environs, others with family or friends. My Father, a poem included in his most recent book, Poems from a Provincial Town, comes into the third category. It describes an event in his father's life and in Dumfries' past.
My father. My father was a man for stopping horses. To screams and yells, preceded by a rattling of rising roar, the beast appeared, head reared, eye rolling black blob, swum in white, battering the cobbles with a bounding cart, frenzied to freeze the heart. But at the sight my father's spirit rose, and as the echoes rang, he ran and sprang, high at the rampant head, and bore it down with all of 14 stone, muscle and bone, hung and hung on. I have never visited his grave. I could not stand in mortal eyes, or seem to take his size. What I remember doesn't lie in any cemetery. I have his stick, rough-handled, thick. And now in my own wintry weather, stumble or slip, I feel his grip. In discussing this particular poem, this is the one about my father stopping horses, the first thing to say is that I was very small at the time when he stopped, for reasons of age, I suppose, as much as anything else, when he stopped stopping horses. But, and so I never saw him stop a horse. But I have seen a runaway horse when I was a little boy in Academy Street. And I expect I saw it through the letterbox, because it's a really scarifying sight. The horse is really berserk. It's frantic. It doesn't know what it's doing. Everybody, of course, is afraid. It looks as though it's going to bash into the sidewalks and all that sort of thing. And so I was sufficiently impressed with the kind of trauma that's created by a runaway horse. It's a thing we don't see nowadays at all. But in those days, it was not all that infrequent. And everybody knew what to expect when they heard the rattle on the cobblestones and that sort of thing. So I had a pretty fair idea of what the scene was like, and what it was my father was taking on when he tried to stop a runaway horse. When I came to write a poem about my father, I didn't think about writing about runaway horses or anything of that sort at all. What was in my mind was really the picture of my father as a very powerful, very strong man, a very well-built man. And I also knew his background, too, of course, by this time, which was that he had come into Dumfries with his father to start a small business. That had a very, very hard time. He'd left school, I don't think he was 11 years old when he left school. And they had a great struggle, of course, as people did in those days, a great struggle to establish himself. And he was always public spirited, you see, and he got into what at that time was the parish council, and then later on into the town council. And towards the end of his career, he became provost of the town. So this was very much in my mind, and you might have thought it would have been a very reasonable thing that there's material here you could write a poem about. But when I came to write the poem, it didn't turn out like that at all. Instead, I went back to that very early picture of the runaway horse. And so, in a sense, this is, I suppose, a kind of distilled essence of what I thought about my father. And of course, it does combine in its way the sort of strength, and I think the public spiritedness of the man too. You see, because this was something that was being done for public safety. So that in effect, it proved to be a very good image. But the thing I would really stress is that it was not a thought-out thing. You see. It's like a great deal, and like a great deal that's the best in poetry, it comes to you. So it is a little bit like perhaps using a planchette board or something of that sort. You fiddle away with it, and then something comes up. You're not altogether sure always that it's been entirely yourself that's been at work in this thing.
Can you tell us when you began to write poetry, and what it was that made you start writing?
Well, I started when I was very, very young indeed, and just as almost everybody does at some time or other, you have a go at doing a rhyme or two and that. But it didn't really amount to anything very much, and I wasn't particularly involved in it. And it was only when I was in my 50s that I fell in with the younger people, and then Writers' Workshop was started here by the resident tutor of the extramural classes, and we formed a group, and we began to publish things. We published Fatal Tree, 5 hours, and it was from that really set me going on it. I never found it easy to write poetry. It's always been a labour to start it. But once started, I become involved with it, and it's very, very often been a case that it's nagged me on to finish. So that's really the story of how I began.
You've written lots of poems about your dogs. What drew you to this as a subject?
Well, first, of course, because I was brought up with dogs. My father was, we always had a dog in the house, and Father was very keen and very, very successful with dogs and that sort of thing. I've never been a sporting person. I've never been one who shot or anything of that kind. But I was used to dogs, and I'm fond of them. Now, I've always kept a dog too. The other thing, of course, was that as one of the dog poems I put out, one of them tells that my brother was killed trying to save a dog, and that, of course, naturally does make a lot of impression. Yeah.
Quinton, collie cross mastiff, broad head and bright brisket, trim and chain collar, steel shining on seal skin, that, and a brassy medallion, and Dobie's dog, Stormont. No more to describe him. I think it said everything. Quinton, home for his supper, home from hell raking, scrounging the golf course, uneasily reckoning insidious time, assessing those hand claps and shoutings ignored. How I went in, slamming the back door. He heard. Quinton, knowing it's Sunday and Sunday Observer, I on the escort invariably first in, aware of words too. What they mean is watch, where, down, damn, and do dead dog. I could go on, I suppose, up to 20. Quinton, weekdays, his dog days, crouched at the casement, glaring my going, leaving him, raging his heart out, pure heart den, tail trembling. No, I don't mean it. Put my hand in. Takes it in his jaws gently. Quinton, at scullery window, at night in the dark, staring, expectant as if to be let in, black in the blackness, eyes shining, glittering out there in the dark. So I see him, though he's been dead a year. Quinton.
But the fact of the matter is that it has to be said that there's a tremendous succession of people who've written poetry and that who do feel that a great deal of inspiration comes from the outside and not from within them. You see. And I'm one of them, I must say. I do think that. And I think that simply for the reason that a great deal of the verse that I've written, and certainly the best of it, a great deal of the best of what I've written, that's not an awful lot, by the way, does seem to have come to me from the outside. I recognise it when I put it down, but I wouldn't altogether feel it's mine. In fact, I've said that. I say that in this.
Samoyed. Over the hedge, into the sheep field, heart feeling, following, breathlessly bellowing, chasing him, chasing the sheep. Stumbling and falling, lose him to find him, curdling their panic, deep in their whiteness, concealing his whiteness, his Arctic-born purity. Not sullen, indifferent, owning no master. Living as different, bold as an equal. How he would sit at the sharp gable angle, lifting his breath to the moon. Not baying or stirring, but endlessly staring, dreaming a wolf dream, hearing the tune. Not with me, but stalking, warily watching, keeping a distance, nothing to share. I, the provider, hardly a name to him. Food, fire, shelter, a lair. So I am thinking as sharp through the tough sod, high on the bank and under the brooms, I push with the last trouble he gives me, lay him in carefully, tamping the verges, lest the clods crumbling soil his bright plumes.
Dumfries, the first poem in Dobie's latest book, highlights his ambivalent attitude to the town and its inhabitants.
No, they're not very good at letting themselves go. You see, you notice that in the first poem in this booklet and that I say about remembering the Armistice Day, and I can remember that. I was 10 years old then. I can remember the churches, of course, were packed to overflowing, but the streets were also packed to overflowing, and I can remember wandering about amongst them, and the crowds seemed to me to be so very aimless, even then as a child. And I can remember at the fountain somebody tried to get dancing going, and that they played some sort of musical instrument, and an accordion, I think, and a number of people began to dance that. But what remained in my mind was that after a few minutes it withered away. Yes.
Dumfries. Low to the earth, half camouflaged in grey, the town is settled like a nesting bird. Huddled and sunk it sits, and yet not brooding either. It's an effect of weather. Spring, autumn, winter, it is cloud or mist. Summer, an ignis fatuus, haze and haze. Only descending on it from the dark does it appear distinct and pinpoint clear. Its people are no easier to define. No one, it seems, stands out. I think that none rooted in this ambiguous soil of flowered memory. No saint, of course, no ecstasy, nothing of eminence, and yet what deaths, what desolations. And in 1305, an unexpected place in Scotland's tortuous story, a spark, a gleam of glory. It did not last, and did not reappear, and now, untypically, is quite forgot, as if the curse it drew, that comprehensive papal ban, still undiluted ran. But no, St. Michael's at the Reformation housed Protestant and Papist turnabout, and if, in Edinburgh, the assembly saw itself deceived, God appeared undispleased. And I recall that first Armistice Day. A child, I wandered with the aimless crowd, half realizing as I watched attempts at dancing cease, Dumfries would be Dumfries. So common sense, at least, remained intact, far, far ahead of what could be expected. And who's to say a gleam of darker times had greater merit, being the rare high spirit?